Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Sailor Nathan Hopkins, pictured here, and two of his comrades from the Union frigate Minnesota strolled through the Virginia countryside one day in late June 1864. They had been given a brief shore leave to stretch their legs, which was occasionally granted to bluejackets to break the monotony of routine patrols along the James River. The area was safe and generally friendly. While they walked, Hopkins' companions related a story they had heard about a monument with a strange inscription located on a nearby hill. They trekked on about a half mile and saw no signs of the monument. Hopkins paused and his mates encouraged him not to give up. It's a little further on, one of the comrades assured him. The trio continued. Soon afterwards, two Confederate pickets stepped out of the brush and confronted the sailors. Hopkins recalled, "My two companions promptly shook hands with our captors, but I did not." Thus began an odyssey that landed Hopkins in Andersonville prison. Hopkins was 23 years old. He had a relatively long connection to the sea and the Navy. Born in Maine and raised in Jewett City, Connecticut, he made his first ocean voyage when he was only 14 and was a veteran sailor by the outbreak of the war. Along the way, he had developed clerical skills that served him well. When he joined the Navy as a paymaster's steward, it was in the autumn of 1861. Was assigned to the store ship Brandywine and spent the majority of the next 2 years aboard the old frigate anchored outside Fortress Monroe, Virginia, seeing no major signs of the war. Then in the summer of 1863, he left the Navy. His term of enlistment was up and got back into the war before the end of the year, this time joining the Army as a recruit in the 12th New Hampshire Infantry. The regiment had suffered severely in the recent battles of Chancellorsville and Gettysburg and desperately needed men to replace their losses. These substitutes bemoaned the historian of the 12th were the dregs of society. Quote, "Such another depraved, vice-hardened, and desperate set of human beings never before disgraced an army. To send such vile rubbish to take the place of the fallen brave and fill up the ranks of the veteran heroes who still remained was an insult to them and a desecration to the memory of their late comrades." End quote. The historian lumped sailors into this motley crew of substitutes, though he acknowledged that some of them made good soldiers. Hopkins didn't spend enough time with the regiment to be fairly judged. On April 30th, 1864, as Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant was on the verge of launching his spring campaign into the heart of Virginia with Major General George Gordon Meade's Army of the Potomac, Hopkins transferred back to the Navy. He reported to Fortress Monroe for duty and joined the crew of the Minnesota. It was a wood frigate, powerful ship, and the crew had distinguished themselves 2 years earlier during the Battle of Hampton Roads and the clash of the ironclad vessels Monitor and Merrimack. Hopkins explained how his fateful shore leave came to be. He wrote, "Sometime in May, about 100 of us from the Minnesota were sent up the James River to do picket duty at night in advance of our fleet. On or about June 28th, 1864, 3 of us went on shore leave for exercise." Unbeknownst to him, the 2 sailors, his comrades, were bounty jumpers, and they had no intentions of staying with the Minnesota crew. They intended to desert at the earliest opportunity. Once the 3 were in Confederate hands, they were marched to the headquarters of the picket guard. There were 2 officers, one older, one younger. They were interrogated by these 2 men. Hopkins' shipmates were quizzed about the strength and position of the Union Navy and freely gave that information. Hopkins, when it came his turn to be interrogated, he was asked a single question on another subject During the previous week, a pair of Confederate sailors had deserted, and the younger officer of the two wanted to know their fate. Hopkins snapped back at them, quote, "We've put them in prison and put a man over them with a drawn sword, the same as we would over any rogues," end quote. At this point, the questioner made a quick motion to his sword hilt and would have drawn the blade and run Hopkins through had not the older officer seized the arm of the younger Confederate officer and held him until he ceased to struggle. The prisoners were then transferred to Richmond. That was the next day, and taken to the provost marshal's office. Hopkins's fellow sailors declared themselves deserters and were taken aside. Hopkins declared himself a prisoner of war and was sent to Libby prison. 2 weeks later, in mid-July, Hopkins and a large number of other prisoners were packed on a train destined for Georgia. Hopkins discovered, perhaps much to his surprise, the two sailors with whom he had been captured were also on board. They'd been held at Castle Thunder with other political prisoners and suspect citizens. Whatever the case he had made for their freedom had been rejected. One of the sailors, who Hopkins described as an Englishman who deserted the British Navy to take advantage of the sizable Union bounties, jumped the train somewhere in North Carolina and disappeared. The other remained on board and kept a low profile. All of them arrived at Andersonville about July 22nd, 1864. 14 long weeks later, on September 27th, 1864, Hopkins boarded a train with about 150 Union sailors. They were headed for Richmond to be paroled and exchanged for a like number of rebel sailors. Hopkins observed that his other shipmate, one of those comrades, remained at Andersonville rather than return to the Union, where he no doubt would face the consequences of attempted desertion. In mid-October, Hopkins' prisoner of war status ended outside Richmond along the James River, not far from where his odyssey had begun 4 months earlier. He and the rest of the prisoners were transferred from a Confederate flag of truce boat to the Union steamer Mary Washington. A newspaper correspondent was eyewitness to the event. Quote, "On coming near the little rebel flag of truce boat, formerly a tow tug, I found its deck full of men whose appearances at once impressed me that they were rebels. Upon inquiry, I ascertained they were our half-starved and half-clothed sailors, whose external semblance gave evidence of bad treatment and worse fare. It was a sad sight." End quote. The reporter continued, "To look upon these heroes shivering under the cool breeze of the morning, many of them with nothing to wrap themselves up," end quote. In an account of his wartime experiences written years later, Hopkins did not detail the particulars of his treatment inside Andersonville, but he did describe his homecoming at Annapolis, Maryland. Quote, "Our condition was such that it was not considered safe to let us use any building, so we were sent direct to Washington, D.C. by railroad. As soon as the gates were opened in the morning, we were marched in a body into the Navy Yard and taken around the rear, were stripped, and the rags, their clothes, burned. Then we were washed and shaved, and our hair cut and given new uniforms, and were once more made fit to be seen by human eyes," end quote. The Navy granted Hopkins a furlough, and he returned to his family in Connecticut. In January 1865, he returned to duty once again and was assigned to the sidewheel steamer Florida. He spent the rest of the war making round trips from New York to New Orleans to deliver supplies to sailors stationed along the Gulf of Mexico. According to Hopkins, the satisfaction among the sailors of the Florida ran high after shore leaves were canceled. Quote, "Many left the ship by boatload," end quote, he remembered. Hopkins eventually joined them and skipped out on the remainder of his enlistment, officially a deserter. Years later, it came back to haunt him. He applied for a military pension. That's when he learned that the government had officially declared him a deserter. He eventually appealed his case, and in February 1923, he received notice that his long delayed pension had been approved by the United States House of Representatives, and it would likely pass the Senate. Unfortunately for Hopkins, by this time, he suffered from tuberculosis and succumbed to the illness 2 months later at age 72. 3 daughters survived him. His wife, whom he married shortly after he left the service, had predeceased him. So thanks for listening to the story of Nathan Hopkins, the sailor whose what was supposed to be a brief shore leave, turned out to be something quite different. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.